Hello and welcome to Empowering Voice, the podcast where we talk about the people and the ideas that are making a real difference in South Asia. I am your host, Hera Nakwi, and I serve as a senior research associate at South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. I'm the researcher who cares deeply about sharing the voice and the stories of marginalized people across the South Asia region. Today, I'm very happy to welcome a truly inspiring guest, Ahalam Fatima. Ahalam studied international development at the University of Birmingham, focuses on disability issues faced by women and children in South Asia. She's also an editor at A Different View, a journal by IAPSS, and she's a co-founder of Exousia Hub, a youth organization in Birmingham, where she served as a chief fundraising officer. Ahalam cares deeply about justice and fairness. Her work looks at the big issues like caste, gender, AI, and how knowledge from minority communities is often unknown. Ahalam, we are so glad to have you with us today. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for the platform. Especially, it's very rarely I get to talk about advocacy and empowering minorities, especially within India, within South Asia. So, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for the platform.
Thank you so much. Let's begin with your story. You have worked closely with the young people from diverse and often marginalized backgrounds, especially with those of disabilities or who come with the low income communities. So, what inspired you to begin this work, and how have these experiences shaped how you see the inequalities in the society?
Well, firstly, this kind of issues are very multi-dimensional in nature, and therefore, when we are seeking answers, it needs to be seen as such and needs to be treated as such. Firstly, talking about the experience that I've had that led me onto this path would be an interaction that I had with a friend of mine who I was casually friends with online, and I only got to meet the person when he wanted to visit the university. And he wanted to do some official works with regards to the university. During that time, I was doing my political science honors from University of Delhi. I was studying in Ramjas College. And during that time, when he came to the campus, he was a visually impaired person. And the way I treated him was very overly protective. I was coddling him all throughout the way. I was very anxious. I was guiding him throughout the pathways, giving him overly descriptive imageries. And even when I took him to the library, when they gave us a written material which did not have any braille script, I was very proactive in reading out to him. It was only later he had to let me know that he had this particular stylus that could read out the reading materials aloud. It could translate what were written into what was written so that he could hear it as it goes. And only even when I had to take him back to his PG, which was in a very overcrowded area, I was very anxious. I was guiding him through each and every conversation he had with a rickshawala, and he had to literally stop me and tell me, "Well, Ahlam, I do this every day. I can navigate this every day. So just let me be." And then he safely got back to his hostel. It was only then. It was after a while I realized how offensive that was, how insulting that was for him as a person with human dignity. And that also kind of highlights how, as a society, we lack awareness on how we want to treat them. And how there is this fine line between empathy and pity. We don't want to pity them too much. We want to empower these kind of communities so that they can go about with their daily life without any issues. And we need to kind of prepare them a kind of environment that is conducive for their growth. But then we shouldn't really be pitying them. We need to have just some kind of empathy for them, and the way we have to behave with them needs to be kind of studied, which led me to join an NGO called Visionaries in Delhi as a volunteer, where in our induction sessions, they kind of gave us a long list of things that we need to be aware of when we interact with these communities. All I had to do that day was offer him my elbow, and he had a walking cane with him. He would have easily navigated through our campus. I should have asked him politely if he needed help with the writing materials. I didn't have to be proactive about it. I had to check in with him. If he wanted help or not, I should have let him be. And it was also during that session when I realized there was a whole lot of technologies for them. There is a whole lot of systems for them that's being constructed, that's being created, that they are creating currently, and it's in a process of evolution. And we should have left them to their devices on certain sense. At the same time, kind of providing them with the right environment for it. And that also kind of touches upon the problem of structural inequality and how structural inequality compounded with, sorry, the systematic inequality compounded with structural inequality drives this issue. When you don't have the right institution, when you don't have this proper structure set in place, them who are already held back on certain matters, we with a very wrong environment tend to hold them back even more. We don't let them develop, we don't let them go in the way that they want to, and they are not able to go that. It's because of the unequal system that they have been provided with, the structures and the institutions that are highly unequal. And it's very rarely where there is this inherent idea of caring for these communities comes from, maybe whether it be a university, whether it be a school, or whether it be any kind of state apparatus for that instance. This kind of systematic inequality needs to be studied. And also, I would say this kind of led me to join Exosia Hub when I went to UK, because I was already in path to this in India, and I kind of understood the kind of environment that it had in India. When I went to UK, I realized, well, I had to study how it works in UK, how the atmosphere would be different, how the kind of attitude the community would have towards the people in UK as opposed to what people would have in India. And I guess that was the beginning of me joining Exosia Hub, when my friends kind of presented with an idea. It's an all-female team. All of those in Exosia Hub are all females, and we kind of deals with youth and children. We mostly deal with youth for that matter, and we deal with people who have had who comes from unfortunate backgrounds and have had very unfortunate events, very harrowing events that they've faced. And while we do provide them with one-on-one sessions, or with maybe employability sessions and things like that, we do try to hone a kind of a sense of community within them, to kind of provide them some kind of a safe house where they could have fun, and to kind of cultivate confidence and self-esteem within these kind of youth, which they lack the most. So we tend to have fun within the organization. It's or that's what we intend to do, to have that kind of a community, which I feel is there in India, while they don't have it back there in UK. There is more of a sense of formalities and a list of things that they have to do for the people in UK, so that the community tends to feel tends to be a little bit hesitant in being involved in these events and organizations, as opposed to in India, where there is more of a sense of a community, but then we don't have enough of those events or enough of such informal sessions. It could be easily doable in India, but then we don't have that in India. So yeah, that's this kind of experience kind of led me onto this path, and ultimately, led me and my research even to be focused within this area.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. Your journey is so powerful. It's a reminder that lived experience is a powerful tool for knowledge, of course. Now, even though your work doesn't directly deal with bonded labors, you focuses on issue like caste, gender that are very closely linked. So, how do you think caste and class impact the chances of young people from these backgrounds have to succeed?
Well, since independence, bonded labor has been criminalized in India. But regardless, it does manifest itself in various forms if you examine closely. Historically, the caste system tend to tie certain people and their communities to certain jobs. And that is how caste system have evolved since then. And the whole basis of caste system is certain kind of community gets to do certain kind of job. And when it comes to with Muslim community, due to cultural influence, there are certain communities that will push down the rungs of our society and even to the outskirts of the society. And if I would say, there is this community called Pasmanda Muslims, who themselves consider the identity of Islam, or of a Muslim, but then the Muslim community does not consider them as a part of themselves, and they have the sense of conflicting identities, and that is very dangerous in terms of how they want to kind of channel their voice. How do they share their lived experience? How do they put forth their agency, and the kind of clash that they have with the identities? And that also pushed them into some kind of a vulnerable issues. And then when you come to class system, inevitably the financial means of it also pushes people to certain jobs. And the issue with both the caste system and the class system is that once they push them towards these kind of jobs, they tend to get stuck there. And so more of those generations that come after themselves do get stuck in this generational cycle, or the kind of iterations that they have in terms of how caste and class manifest itself in the kind of jobs that they could do. And most of these jobs are very harmful in terms of not just their human dignity, but then also physically. Their health gets harmed, and also their human dignity is seen lesser to what the rest of the communities have. And I would say one of the examples is manual scavengers. It's a banned or it's a restricted activity, but then people still do it despite all that. We have women and children doing the beady rolling within the factories. And there is no such kind of regulations, or if there are state regulations, it's not really enforced, or the state policies are not enforced, and all of this leads these particular community to be involved in very dangerous ideas, and also a kind of a loop where themselves, their children, and the generations that come after are stuck on this loop, and they have to keep on working, and there is just no respite out of it. The redressal system that the government had or the state has, and the redressal system that the wider society has is firstly it's very ineffective. There are certain policies and systems in place, but then the kind of bureaucracy involved tends to make it very tiring to kind of for a person to go through the process. And even getting to courts, it's such a hassle. It involves a lot of money, and only people who can afford it can get through it. And even the kind of involvement that the civil society can have, even the NGOs can have, is very restrictive. It can only work the extent of funds it could have. And I feel that most of the NGOs that work these days tend to go at areas where more fundings are present. So the kind of works that NGO that works with these kind of societies tends to come down a lot because there's no such profit in them, and it's more of a long term process. If you want to live generations up out of it, that's a long term process, and very few civil society members tend to stick on with that process. So yeah, that is also one of the issues that I feel needs to be addressed when it comes to caste and class. And when we talk about opportunities, there are educational opportunities, there are certain kind of economic opportunities that the state has, but then very few people from these communities are aware of it. So there is a lack of awareness of it, so therefore many of these people don't tend to pursue it, and even those people who gets to pursue it, it only gets to do it in a very temporary amount of time. They don't stick on with it for a long period of time. They don't grasp these opportunities and hold on it for a long period of time. So there is no long-term gains in it. Because if we are going to keep them for a long-term basis, we need to make sure that they don't dip back into this process. So if we are going to provide them with financial allowance, we need to make sure that the children or the youth tends to stay on that line. Or if we are going to provide them with the employability opportunities, you need to make sure that they get to stay there for a long-term basis, and it could be only done by proper evaluation and monitoring by the respective agencies and institutions that are present. But then, when the institutions and agencies do not do that, it tends to kind of these people tend to fall back into this loop, like I said, and they get stuck on it. And the kind of attitude from the people also kind of holds them within that. So the wider community does not accept them as their own, and they're seen less of it. So I would say the kind of systematic inequality that's present, it would only go if caste and class issues is of 100% abolished, or at least reduced to a certain extent. If we do not have any of those kind of either of these evils, if we do not banish them, it will be very difficult to kind of navigate this issue, and it would be very difficult for the people of these communities to kind of navigate and to attain the kind of social mobility that they would like. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say about this issue.
That's such an important point. Of course, caste and class are deeply connected and continue to shape accesses to education, work, basic dignity. Thank you so much for making it so clear. So you have that opportunity to work in two different systems like India and the UK. So what are the differences you have seen in how each society responded to marginalization, disabilities, and financial hardships? Are there any lessons that South Asia could learn from UK?
Well, actually, in UK, there are lots of opportunities, and I would say a lot of policies in terms of how states implement them. set in place in most of their institutions. So if I would say, if you go to a university, they would have certain points where people with disability or even people with financial instability within their lives, they kind of get rooted into a system or a process that's already set in place. It's a very effective system that they have, and they are kind of it's state sponsored, and if it's a university, they do take care of that program really well with proper budgeting allowances given to them, with proper specialists and experts being running those kind of programs, and it kind of provides them with with a safe space, a safety net for these people to navigate their educational experience. Even in schools, they have certain kind of programs, certain systems that these people are put into from when they're diagnosed to the time when they need proper kind of timetables and things like that. They do have proper system set in place, a very well oiled machine that works extremely well. Whether if you go into hospitals, if you go into supermarkets, all of these institutions have a system set in place which makes it easier for these people to navigate. And I would say the very important thing that comes into my mind would be the physical accessibility. Almost all of their buildings, almost all of their how do I say, institutions have physical infrastructure set in place that that is very inclusive in nature. They would have braille in all of their elevator points. They would have a ramp so that people who have issues walking could use those ramp. They would have, if it's a library, they would have a certain type of system set in place so that they could navigate. Even if it's a card tapping, they do not really need a second person to help them through. A person who is visually impaired could easily navigate their lives due to the kind of accessibility that the physical infrastructure provides. And I would say, if it's a traffic crossing in India, how difficult is it for ourselves to kind of cross a simple zebra line crossing? But then in UK, there tends to be a Brady script for the button where they want to kind of that you want to press for it to turn green, and there's a noise that comes that let the people know that it's time for you to cross. So these kind of features that are kind of incorporated into their society so well, so that the daily life is so easy for them to navigate. As opposed to that in India, I might say, I would give the example of my own university. When there was a road work, they kind of dug up the entire footpath. Initially, my university did have those tiles which a visually impaired person could navigate through. But then once they dug up, they didn't really put them back in, which made it very difficult for these people to kind of navigate. There's this also issue of no type of barriers to let them know that the road is going to end here. You might have to move away and walk, or any such kind of systems were not set in place, which makes it very harder for them to kind of navigate even their daily life. How difficult would it be if they want to pursue larger goals or bigger goals? And I realized how much it restricts people within our community and how we need to improve on that basis. So I would say physical infrastructure is a huge issue that manifests itself in our life. And then secondly, I'd have to say that in India, one of the issues is that if it's a state that's doing a is doing a project, or if it's a NGO who is doing a project, most of it comes in the form of a grant or an aid. And more of them are given by certain donors, or if it's a state sponsor, it comes from your budget. And when most of these projects are done, it tends to be done on a target base. They have goals that they have to achieve. And I would say it's more of a systematic approach, a system-based approach, where you have this much amount of money. You need to do a project for this particular community, and you need to achieve this. And most of these goals that they have to achieve tend to be very short term. And even if you have kind of long term goals, it's not properly evaluated or monitored. It's very rarely you find projects that have proper monitoring, proper regulation, and very rarely institutions tend to look back, learn the lessons, and apply it in our projects so that you could make it more effective. The issue becomes very system centric, as when it becomes very systematic, is because they tend to do programs depending upon their observation of the community. They look at the community, they do surveys, they do ask what they actually wanted to ask the community what they would want to be implemented. But then they tend to work on the assumptions that they have. So it's an outsider look out of it. And so they do a project based on what they think the community needs, not what the community actually needs. And I would say if you have to get to that kind of an approach, you would have to seek human-centric design approach, which is a very recent method that most of the NGOs pursue. Most of them tend to go by systems approach. Very few NGOs test human-centric approach. Human-centric approach is very iterative. It's very tiring. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of time also. It's very lengthy process, but then it goes into the community. It asks the community what it wants. It applies it, and then they do the program, and then it again go back to the community, ask them if the program is okay, and if they have any other changes that needs to be made. If the community says no, we need changes to be made, they again go back, put adjust the program again, and then they monitor it again, go to the community. It's a very iterative approach. It's a very it's a more of a cyclic in nature. It goes for a long period of time. It's labor intensive, and maybe that's why many of the NGOs shy away from using it. Many multinational companies do use this within their projects. But then I would say it's mostly because they have tangible outcomes that they accept out of it. But then it's very difficult for a country like India to kind of implement this, considering the kind of identities we have, the kind of multiple overlaying of identities that people assume. So you're not just a woman, you have this diverse roles. You could come from South India. You could be a woman, you could be a Muslim, you could be a Dalit, you could be anything. And any kind of identity you assume, there's this multiple identities stacked upon each other. And when there is overlaying of identities, it's very difficult for us to even know what kind of programs would be good for these communities. So imagine a disabled person who doesn't really speak Hindi because that's what he's studying in a North Indian. Maybe I'll say in a Delhi university. He comes from South. His Hindi is not fluent. He's disabled. And let's just change his gender. It's a girl. It's a woman. The kind of identities that's on top of this person pulls them back a lot. It's multiple identities. They don't get to share their experiences properly. They don't get to voice. They don't even have a proper channel to voice whatever they feel. And all of these identities. It's very common in India. I would say South Asia is more of a diverse background with multiple identities, as opposed to a country like UK where it's very binary, or the kind of differences they have does not amount to what India would have. So when we look at the programs that's been employed in UK, the kind of approach that most of the policy makers use in UK, it's very difficult to apply that in India. So I feel like we need to take in mind that whenever we talk about employing or looking to the West and seeing whatever works for them and trying to apply that to India, it's very difficult. I would say it's very difficult to apply that in South Asia in general. You need to be very careful of the identities, the context, the kind of class differences, the caste systems that we have. The geographical location matters a lot. You could come from a mountainous area, you could come from a non-mountainous area, you could come from south, north. All of these tend to differ. It's very diverse. So I would say when you asked about a kind of program that I find it really well in UK and how good it would be to apply in India, I would say there are systems set in place in most of the institutions. We could have that, but then I would be very careful in employing employing the same thing in India because of the context that we have are different. And I would also urge a lot more of researches to be done within this area, because most of the researchers or academics who tend to pursue PhD and tend to go into researching, kind of forget about people with disability. I would say there is very less research that's being put out, especially in South Asia, with regards to disability. And I would say when I was doing international development, University of Birmingham, we had a particular department for disability, a particular module for disability. You could find that's very rarely you could find something of that sorts in India. So I find that there is this huge gap in terms of how academia have involved themselves within this area, and how necessary it is for us to research and have proper budget allocation for these research to support them, to kind of learn about these community and what kind of projects would be good. How would we be able to uplift them? How can we, target the systematic inequality and make the society a better world? It might be a little bit idealistic in approach. It might be a little bit utopian even. But then I feel that if there is not even some kind of research or learning done on that process, then we cannot even improve in that matter. So yeah, that's what I feel.
I totally agree with you. That was a very helpful comparison. No country has a perfect system, but there are many things South Asia can learn. So, moving ahead, in your experience, what kind of educational or support programs really makes a difference in the lives of marginalized youth?
Well, when we talk about marginalized youth, I'd have to kind of examine it more from a university aspect of it.
Yeah.
One thing that stuck with me the most was that in UK, when a person who want to pursue a degree feels that they've got some kind of disability. And when I say disability, it can be of any kind. It could be of visual impairment, hearing impairment. It could be intellectual disabilities or physical disabilities. Any disability that belongs on that spectrum usually gets to go to a state-sponsored or state proposed doctor. So they go to these doctors, they get whatever disability that they have, they get diagnosed of that disability, and then they get to go back to the university, tell the university that they've got the diagnosis paper. They show the university, and the university and the program that they want to enroll in automatically guides them towards counselors who are there in the university. So once they go to the counselors within each department, so if I was doing my international development, I was doing international development, our department had a particular session who deals with the counselors and even mentors who had to talk with the people with disabilities. And once they talk with them, these mentors provide them with a proper, not just their, they would provide them with a timetable, the kind of, so some people tend to follow their classes faster, but then some people with certain kind of disability tends to be a little bit slower. They would need more time to kind of pursue certain classes. Sometimes your classes would be happening at one end of the university, sometimes another end of the university. So the counselors kind of look at the disability level of the person, the kind of disability, the nature of disability that they have, and they tailor or customize their timetable and the program for them. So some of the module that might take me 6 months to learn, which is fixed for the university, a person with disability might be given maybe 7 months or 8 months to kind of learn. So a kind of tailor entire course for themselves. But then they do it under the guise of anonymity. So the rest of the batch doesn't know that the person sitting next to you might be even disabled because some of the disability doesn't, it's not physical. But then the mentor might know, and that the professor who's teaching the module might know. But then the way they kind of handle the matter kind of protects the dignity of the person who's sitting next to it. They don't feel less despite having disability. So the process is very smooth. They get a very tailored, customized timetable depending upon the kind of disability that they have. Plus, their assignments or the exams that they have to give is also tailored to their needs. So sometimes if I get like a certain deadline, a person with disabilities might get another deadline. But then because the whole system is also, what do I say, digitalized, it kind of provide them with a sense of anonymity. Their dignity is protected, but at the same time there is this very ease of doing matter. It's very customized. It doesn't hold them back. If a person who wants to pursue education, they want to pursue a certain subject, they tend to do it because they have the system available for it, they have the environment available for it, so they tend to pursue their dreams. It's much more, how do I say, easier for them to pursue their dreams, and the burden upon themselves is a little bit less. But then, as opposed to that, in India, we don't have any such seamless system. We don't necessarily get a seamless transition from a state diagnosed doctor to a proper counselor. And most of these counselors or mentors that the university or schools provide are not even certified or not even properly not proper experts for it. And I feel that it could be more of a corruption of morality and the kind of inefficiency that's riddled in the system that we really need to troubleshoot for that matter. This is just one very good system that I saw in UK, and I've understood how good it is to have that kind of seamlessness to it. Say it would be a very good program that India could adopt into our system. Uh, but then we've never had. I've not really gotten a hold of of a university that have done it really well, or a good central university that have been able to employ this matter really well, because of the kind of bureaucracy we have, the kind of the bureaucracy that we have. It kind of slow things down, and by the time a person who really wants to pursue education goes through this system, they tend to, themselves say, no, we don't, it's better to kind of earn money through some other ways, or things like that. But some people do end up, especially communities in South Asia, do end up going through this whole process, tiring themselves, I would say, due to the kind of cultural, aspirational burden and the cultural expectations that people put on them. Many people in India consider education as the highest form of, what do I say, achievement. If you do not have a degree, you're not considered, a well-established person or any of that sorts. So most of the people with disability tend to stick with this very inefficient and burden system just to get the achievement that they want, so that at least you have some kind of respectability within the society, and that is very saddening, I might say. Um, so yeah, that's what there is another issue that I feel we need to be study upon is the kind of digital divide we have with the UK and within India. In UK, you have access to all kind of technologies. It's very affordable for them because either universities provide them with it for one whole year. You have access to all these kind of technologies. You can pursue your education without any problem because you have these processes and technologies set in place to make your life easier. But in India, only people who have money get to afford those systems. So again, it's the issue of class system where only people with who belong to the elite community, who belong to the better part of our society, tends to have access to these amenities. And despite these amenities being very important for their daily life, so it's very important, it's need based amenities for them, but then it's very difficult for people in India who comes from a lower financial background or even from a lower rungs of caste system to kind of afford these technologies. So yeah, I feel it's a very there are certain things that have amazed me and that we can inculcate in India, but then it needs to be it needs to be studied more, and it's a matter of lot of patience if you're going to pursue this matter, further.
Yes, well defined response. Thank you so much for sharing the ground reality. Moving ahead to the last question, how do you see the grassroots advocacy growing in South Asia, especially when it's come to the issues like caste, gender, poverty, and what role can youth lead platform like Exosia plays in building a more fair and inclusive future?
So when I talk about grassroots advocacy, let me talk about UK first and what Exosia does. So Exosia is currently based in Birmingham, and we are only taking in volunteers and people who are part of that particular, but that particular geographical locality for now. And our long-term vision is to have such kind of community centers within most of the cities as possible, and if God allows, kind of expand it to to other countries, most probably South Asia for that matter. So community based, we were looking into having more of a community induced projects that are sustained and that led and developed by the community themselves. So the people within the community gets together, they decide what they want to do and how they want to do. They are very involved in the kind of programs that they want to develop within the organization, and we kind of provide them or support them in that matter, structurally and financially. And then if this program are locally done and done by the community themselves, so the community knows what they want, and it's not something the outsider wants to do. It's not what we think. It needs to be done by the community. It's this whole insider outsider perspective that Nancy Naples were talking about, where what outsider thinks should be done would not be what the insider wants. And it's only when you let the community themselves to do whatever they want to do, you tend to give them that kind of epistemic justice. You tend to provide them with the proper agency for them to have their own voice. So that's what Exosia intend to do. When we talk about India, for that matter, the India's federal system, it does have state apparatus set in place already. So we have all these kind of decentralized local systems. We have all these village offices. We have all these city-run, programs. It would be nice if with these programs, any kind of projects for disability are involved. So you have these structures already available in India. All these kind of grassroots structures are available. Most of the political parties have their own youth wings that do a lot of programs that are very decentralized in nature, and it's very grassroots in nature, I might say. So it would be nice if most of these state apparatus and even these political parties, for that instance, tend to adopt people with disability and people, especially youth with disability, within their projects. Most of our Ministry of Human Resource and for Women tend to do all these employability programs, vocational skill training, and they do have a lot of these buildings set in space for it, set in place for it. But even though it's a more of a top-down matter, it would be very good if most of these programs have projects that involves disability and people with disability. So I would say the thing with India is that you have proper state, you have the apparatus for it, you have structures for it. But then if institutions develop more in the area of inculcating inclusivity, and there is more care and nurturing that is put into these kind of programs, we could uplift people from this community in a very good manner. And I would say it's very imperative that most of these programs needs to be done in a very efficient manner. It's not just I would say the kind of bureaucracy we have, the red tape that we have, tend to makes it very difficult. But then the government system themselves do have the structure for it. And when it comes to the civil society, I really hope that most of the NGOs are more kinder or are more ready to invest into more of the researchers for these people. More investment needs to go into the kind of programs that these people want, and I really hope that most of these NGOs employ human-centric approach rather than a system-based approach, and we have more of a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. And it is only when we have the community themselves involved in these, we would be able to create a much better system, especially considering the diversity that we have here. It's only when we have the community themselves involved, we would be able to make sure that it's very inclusive, it's very customizable, and it is very conducive for them to kind of go about their daily lives and at the same time achieve long-term goals that they have. And maybe improve the kind of condition that they have with regards to their human dignity, which I believe everyone should have in a very equal manner. So that's what my take on it.
That's a very hopeful message. Your work shows that the real change happens when we listen, infuse more voice, and create space for young people to lead. Halam, thank you so much for joining us today. You share your thought with such clarity and hope. And everyone who is listening to the Empowering Voice, thank you for being with us. If you found this conversation meaningful, please share it and leave us a review. And stay tuned for more future conversation. Until next time, thank you so much for joining. Take care and keep speaking for the change.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the platform. And it was very lovely having you at the other end. It felt really safe and very nice to have someone, prod you on as you tend to share your matters or something so fragile and vulnerable as these. So thank you so much for lending me a hearing ear, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Looking forward. Take care. Until next time. Thank you. Take care.
You too.